So we're going to talk for a few minutes about arguments. Not one of you saying, oh no, we're not. Oh, don't. Oh well. Both our gospel passage and the letter from James will refer to this when we hear them later on. But I wanted to think about, why do we argue with our families and our friends? Now, I don't want you sort of airing too many grievances here, but I'll give one example from our household that a long time ago, Holly and I very much enjoyed a sci-fi series called Battlestar Galactica. If you ask Holly, she will say that she recommended it to me. I'm pretty sure that I recommended it to her, and this has become a very long-running family joke. I think we probably watched it before the kids came along, or they were very, very young, and they will all know, like, to take sides, or if they want to stir, they'll bring up Battlestar Galactica. So what other kinds of things do we argue about? John says he doesn't argue, he just says, yes, dear. I'm not going to... Yeah. Paula? Different opinions, yep. And we certainly, having had an election, we've seen lots of those going on. And obviously there's the US election in progress at the moment as well, where we're seeing an awful lot of arguments. And it's a shame when politics ends up poisoning relationships within families and within friendships. Any other things? Religion, yes. Stupidly, I don't have that on my little list. And religion, pretty much every religion, as Helen was saying last week, every significant religion in the world has treat other people as you would like to be treated as one of its core tenets. So you would have thought that we wouldn't be arguing too much about it. So the list of things I've got are money, relationships, all kinds of sort of, you don't treat me right, all kinds of things. Chores, I guess particularly with parent-child relationships, you need to do, but actually also, within other relationships, no, I do all the cooking, you need to pull your weight over here or whatever. I'm not going to repeat the comments that are coming from certain areas around, but we can talk about that later on. I hope that things are getting more equal on that front. But anyway, being inconsiderate, you stayed out and didn't bother letting me know that you were coming home late or whatever it was. And outside our friends and family, we can also have arguments at work. I mention this because at the moment, I'm having very heated arguments on a couple of topics. Fortunately, I won't go into the details. They would be immensely tedious to you. But that make a huge difference to me, and I feel myself being stressed because of this. So, okay, it's kind of easy to identify what we argue about. How do we end an argument? Anyone got any good tips? Agree to differ. Yeah, that can help. Saying sorry. Oh, I like that one. Thank you, Chris. Compromise. Yep. There can often be a difference between resolving an issue and ending an argument. Often you can end up, well, we're just too tired to argue about this anymore, but actually nothing's changed. And I would say in a bad argument, really bad argument, even trying to reconcile, trying to say, okay, I'll compromise, or okay, we're having this argument, but let's not take it too far or whatever, that can be seen as manipulative and trying to, passively, aggressively get your own way and things. Now, let me let you into a secret. I knew, putting the order of service together on Tuesday, that I wanted to talk about arguing in the all-age dress. But I then found it difficult, just this morning, to work out an ending. I was thinking about how we end arguments, is there something I can say about ending arguments well? didn't have any good ideas. And then I thought about, how does God want us to end arguments? There are some trite answers that sort of come in later in the sermon about trying to avoid having arguments in the first place by humility keyword this morning, having empathy, etc. But once you are in the middle of an argument, it's so difficult. So let's move from how God might want us to end arguments to how God ends arguments. Because people have been arguing with God, or at least not following God's will, basically forever. And the Bible has 2 examples of God ending arguments. I'm sure you could say more than 2. We can come to that at the door. In Genesis, God sent a flood. And that didn't, it seems, help to resolve anything. And then God said they'd never do that again. Now, a theological question for another time is whether God changed their mind. Is this God expressing regret? That asks all kinds of really deep questions about our faith. Not going into that now, certainly not in an all-age address. But the second way, thousands of years later, was God sending Jesus. The crucifixion and resurrection are a new way of ending the argument, resolving that gulf between humanity and God. It hasn't made us all follow God's will. If the resurrection had been the stopping point of all of people going their own way, my word, the world would be a rather better place. But as Christians, we can still believe that in a deeper sense, it has still ended the argument. If I'd thought about this before, we would probably be singing in a minute hymn 324 in a byre near Bethlehem, and you may want to go and look at it later on. But just the start of the last 2 verses, which I won't sing, partly I don't want to inflict that on you, and partly I can barely ever sing these without a lump coming in my throat. On the hill of Calvary, placed to end all hope of living, the most precious word of life breathed his last and died, forgiving, for the good of us all. In a garden, just at dawn, near the grave of human violence, the most precious word of life cleared his throat and ended silence, for the good of us all. That is God ending the argument. It's not something we can mirror in our own arguments, but if we think about it more, maybe we can end up in fewer of them.
This is James, chapter 3, verses 13 to chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. The wisdom from above. Is there anyone among you who is wise and understanding? He is to prove it by his good life, by his good deeds performed with humility and wisdom. But if in your heart you are jealous, bitter, and selfish, don't sin against the truth by boasting of your wisdom. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven. It belongs to the world. It is unspiritual and demonic. Where there is jealousy and selfishness, there is also disorder and every kind of evil. But the wisdom from above is pure, first of all. It is also peaceful, gentle, and friendly. It is full of compassion and produces a harvest of good deeds. It is free from prejudice and hypocrisy, and goodness is the harvest that is produced from the seeds the peacemakers plant in peace. Friendship with the world. Where And when you ask, you do not receive it because your motives are bad. You ask for things to use for your own pleasures. Oh, sorry. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Sorry, thank you.
A reading from the book of Mark, chapter 9, starting at verse 30. Jesus predicts his death a second time. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were, because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant, and were afraid to ask him about it. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet, because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be the first must be the very last and the servant of all." He took a little child, whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." Thanks be to God.
So just as a reminder of the service I preached on September the 1st, the reading from James again then said, "Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and to become angry." And I mentioned Micah, "Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God." I'm starting to wonder whether I'll end up attaching that Micah verse to every one of my sermons. It feels so key to our faith, our walk with God. So my summary of the sermon today will be that our relationships with each other reflect and impact our relationship with God. I mentioned that humility would be an important word today, and I don't think it was in the translation that Jane was reading, but in the NIV that I was using. It says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom." And again, as I said 3 weeks ago, James is not making the case for salvation through good deeds. There is no heresy here. But wisdom leads to humility, to understanding that you do not have all the answers. And that leads to being quick to listen. I'd say it works the other way round as well, that humility then leads to wisdom. Just like last time when I was a little concerned over power imbalances, there's a tricky aspect here as well. Again, from the NIV, I don't think the Good News had this word, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. And all of that sounds good to me, except submissive. Submitting to the will of God? Absolutely, no problem. Submitting to each other within equal power relationships? Yes. Submitting to those with power over you who will then abuse that power makes me nervous. It feels like calling for people to be submissive has done immense harm over centuries. Just like I asked within my all-age address, James asks why we argue with each other. And he has a slightly different answer. He says, don't these arguments come from your desires that battle within you? That's a sort of underlying cause, often selfishness versus generosity. Will I do something for you, or will I focus on what I can get? And initially, when I read this, I felt a bit down about it. And I thought there's actually a really positive aspect here. So often, within readings, or certainly within preaching, there's the idea of, well, God being good and humanity is awful. James is saying we have desires that battle within us. That can only happen if there is also compassion and generosity within us, coming back to God making us all in God's image. We are not these awful, awful people that sometimes we can get the impression of. There is good within us. There is God within us. But yes, also selfishness, greed, envy, etc. This passage from James ends with an intriguing phrase: come near to God and God will come near to you. And first, it sounds transactional. If you're good, do good things and God will give you good things. And there are lots of psalms like this, and I have real problems with them, basically saying God will smite the evil, but no bad things will happen to good people. Do we think no bad things happen to good people? It's not the way that life works. But there is, again, just like God ending the argument with the resurrection, there is a deeper way in which it does feel true, saying, come near to God and God will come near to you. I believe it is easier to catch glimpses of God at work when we are already trying to look at the world through God's perspective. When we are humble, putting each other first, trying to see the other point of view. And that's what I mean by our relationships with each other impacting our relationship with God. So speaking of God's perspective, we can't get much closer to that than hearing from Jesus. So let's look at Mark's Gospel. There are basically three chunks here. First, Jesus predicting his own death and the disciples not understanding. Then the disciples arguing about who is the greatest. And it's like, oh, it's the disciples messing up again. And we should be thankful for the disciples and the fact that they're always messing up, because it makes it so much easier for us to put ourselves in their place. Imagine how depressing the Gospels would be if the disciples always got everything right. We would feel utterly unable to connect with it. Anyway, it's an aside. Finally, Jesus talks about welcoming a small child, someone without any rank in the world, no status. Now, Jesus doesn't mention humility directly, but sort of explains it or gives an example. Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and servant of all. And again, I'm still slightly uneasy about anyone who wants to be first. It's still sounding as if we're saying, do this if you want the best place in heaven. It's sort of treating Christianity as a pension scheme. You put in all of this now, and yep, you don't get to have the nice things while you're putting in your pension, but you'll have a great pension in heaven. I don't think that's what Jesus was meaning. It would be arrogant of me, certainly very arrogant, to say that's definitely not what Jesus intended. But I don't find it a helpful way of looking at that. Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last. Instead, I think of what God sees as a better way of living together. And the third chunk is reminiscent of the parable of the sheep and goats. You know, the truly I tell you what you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. The child has no rank, can't return any favours. If you welcome the child in, you're not asking for anything in return. It's a selfless act. It's interesting to note that societies have typically treated children well to some extent, and we can think about child slavery, etc., but there's usually in most societies some idea of you need to treat children well, and that sort of makes sense in terms of self-preservation. If you say, right, you've been born, you better sort your life out independently now, we wouldn't be here. Society has not typically treated the elderly as well. When society has deemed, note, when society, not me, when society has deemed, you've done your bit now, you're no use anymore, maybe we don't treat the elderly as well. I think how society treats the very young and the very old can be instructive as to where that society is putting its values. I haven't mentioned that first chunk. Jesus predicting his own death. Now you could look at it and think, well, that's entirely separate from the disciples arguing and welcoming a child. But to me, it fits because the need for it is explained by the other chunks. If our relationship with God were right to start with, we wouldn't be squabbling over who's the greatest. We wouldn't need to be told to welcome children. The argument wouldn't be happening, so wouldn't need to be resolved. Sermons are generally expected to end with a call to action of some sort. And in some ways that's really easy to do today. I would say it's humility is a holy calling. The practice of humility is much, much harder because it's not pity or condescension, and something that starts as true humility can easily veer into that. It's not fake modesty. It's not denying your own value, your own rights and needs. It is something much more graceful and is a gift of grace. So James says, come near to God and God will come near to you. And I read this and pray for all of us. If we are humble in all our relationships, we will see God. Amen.